So I drew Patrick, and I drew Squidward, but I'm missing SpongeBob. So in this video, I'm going to try to draw SpongeBob in this like pop art style, and my goal is to use the most saturated colors to see how to make that work. And here's some things that I learned. So the first thing I wanted to tackle was to use a good color scheme, and I'm going to use a complementary color, and pretty much yellow and purple are completely across from each other on the color wheel, and that provides really good contrast. And especially when I crank up the saturation, it's gonna help between these two. In theory, as long as I've used the colors opposite from each other on the color wheel, it should work. But it's not as simple as that, because you still have to take into account your saturation and your value. And to be honest, out of all the things, I feel like value is what makes your image the most readable. I'm going to use two colors, yellow and purple, and I'm going to crank up those saturations, and I'm not going to try to use other colors because it might be too distracting, especially with the high saturation that I'm using. Sometimes when you don't know where to go for colors, I like to go on Google Images and find like a color scheme that works. For this one, I found an Xfinity banner and I took their yellow and purple, and I'm going to use that as a jumping off point. So I'm going to start out with the flat colors. I'm going to mask off my SpongeBob. That way when I go to shade him, I don't have to worry about coloring outside the lines. I like to use a polygon tool because it really defines my shapes, but you can do whatever method that you want. The purple was looking a little too cool with the yellow, so I warmed it up a little bit, and then I'm going to carve out the major shadows with that background color. When you're carving out shadows, I would say start with the biggest shapes first and then slowly go down into the details, because if you can make it readable with your bigger shapes, then you're in a good spot to focus on details, and it's a lot easier to correct big things than a bunch of small things. I'm also shading with the background color because I'm going to pretend that there's a lot of atmospheric perspective, so all this fog is going to be purple and it's going to help build up the scene just a little bit. I could go with a different shadow color, but at least for this color scheme it worked pretty well, and having that purple contrast with the yellow, it kind of gave it a nice little balance. And after I add like my first core shadows, then I'm gonna go in and add in like the ambient occlusion, so everything where his like holes are, that's gonna be way darker because there's gonna be less light bouncing around in those areas to help sell the illusion of 3D. So the hole itself is going to be dark, and then you're going to notice that there's like this little white rim, and that's because light is like hitting that little edge of that hole, and that's still part of the sponge, so that's going to be a lot lighter, and that kind of helps give it 3D. And then especially when you draw it to perspective, that helps a lot. So with the eyes, a common mistake is people just use pure white for the eyeballs, and it has a cartoony look, but it's not realistic, and it can look pretty uncanny if you do it for a more rendered piece. So if you just make it slightly more gray than the skin tone and bring it just a little bit lighter, I feel like that's usually the best result. And then you kind of shade it like a sphere, so the edges is going to get dark, but what helps me a lot is like, don't make your eyes pure white unless that you're going for an anime or cartoon style. Another reason I say this is that if you have super shiny surfaces, it's gonna hard to make white stand out if everything is light. So in order to have something shiny, you need something really dark to make that white specular lighting pop out. And that's how you do those little glimmers in the eyeballs, is like you make it like a little bit darker, and then once you add that pure white, it's gonna make it super shiny. For skin, I'm using like this orange color. I'm not really darkening up the values, I'm just like making it way more saturated, and I'm just gonna block out the shapes, and then I take like this textured smudge tool and I kind of smudge it out, and that gives a little bit of variation, and then from there I color pick everything. For me, what helps a lot doing like these vibrant saturated color paintings is that with my shadow, instead of going to pure black, I make it darker and more saturated, and I really crank up that saturation, and it kind of gives it a nice little pop to it. Also, don't be afraid to limit your color palette, because it makes you work with the colors that you have, and it gives the piece a little bit more cohesion. It's also a lot easier to bring focus to the areas that you want focus on, because all you have to do is change the color from the background and make it more saturated, and bam, you have instant focus right there. So at this point of the painting, I'm adding a little bit of rim light on the shadow side, and that's going to help SpongeBob pop out. And then I'm also focusing on just a little bit of textures, and this is where I take my airbrush and I kind of just slightly airbrush the areas so that it doesn't look as flat, and you want to be very subtle with this, but it adds a lot. And then the cool thing about it is it gives you a hard edge and a soft edge, and that really helps with like rendering areas. So right now SpongeBob's hand is kind of fading into his body because the value and colors are pretty similar. So I'm going to mask him out, and then I'm going to turn his hand a little bit more purple so he kind of pops out, and then I'm probably going to give him a little bit more harsher shadings with like more rim lights, and that way his hand is going to stand out from his face. After that, I'm going to add another round of ambient occlusion, and where the little pockets and where things are touching each other, I'm going to darken it up with like a very dark purple. So I'm pretty happy how SpongeBob is, and now it's time to work on the background. Because I'm going for a pop art style, I'm going to outline him with white, so he's going to look like almost like a Paper Mario cutout. And I always as a graphic designer, I always like doing this for my more graphic pieces because it gives it just a little bit of style. I mean, for realism, it's not realistic, but it helps provide that contrast and it gives it that cutout sticker look. Now I'm going to add a gradient filter over all my layers, and this is going to help unify my colors a little bit, and it also makes the flat color have a little bit of variation, and just a tiny bit of gradient can go a long way. I'm also playing around with the blend modes. Usually I go soft light or overlay, and then I usually crank down the opacity a lot, and it gives it a good little variation. I'm going to paint a little bit of texture on the background now, and with the background, it's a background, so I don't have to really detail it that much, but as long as there's something there, it kind of adds a lot to it. The right side I'm going to make darker because that's where the shadow is, and I'm going to pretend that there's a little bit of light coming on the left side. And then I'm going to add a little bit of particles and clouds, and this helps give it just a tiny bit of motion to it. This was like probably one of the more fun parts because it's more of just like your brushwork rather than trying to paint in perspective, and this is where I kind of turn off my brain. And then I'm adding a little bit of filigree, I'm adding a little bit of half tones to give it a little bit more texture, and it adds a lot. Alright, so this is my final piece. I'm pretty happy with how he turned out, and I feel like having those saturated colors really helped pop them out. And I thought the saturation colors was gonna ruin the piece, and I kind of did it as a joke to show you guys what not to do, but I ended up really liking the piece, ironically. So here is SpongeBob, Squidward, and Patrick, and thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you guys have a good one.